Good morning, everyone. I'm Emily Akhtarzandi, Managing Director of Atlantic Live, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this Atlantic Exchange with Jim Shelton. Atlantic Exchanges are one-on-one conversations between Atlantic editors and dynamic people doing remarkable things. Our discussions have featured everyone from Bill Gates to Mark Zuckerberg, Richard Branson, and David Rubenstein. And today, we're delighted to add Jim Shelton to that list. In his former role as Deputy Secretary of Education, Jim oversaw the $650 million Investing in Innovation Fund. He has also served as the Program Director of the Education Division of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He is now the Chief Impact Officer of 2U Inc., a technology services provider for nonprofit colleges and universities. Our Washington editor-at-large, Steve Clemons, will interview Jim about education, the high school dropout crisis, and the solutions that are working to keep our nation's children on track to graduation. A few housekeeping notes. We'll be tweeting at Atlantic_live and would love for everyone to join the dialogue with hashtag ATLX. And for our friends who are not able to attend, the event will be live streamed at theatlantic.com/live. We will have time at the end of the program for your questions. And I would like to thank our underwriters who have made this event possible, WNET and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, in celebration of American Graduate Day. And before we begin, I would like to introduce one of our distinguished guests, Pat Harrison, President and CEO of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, to give our opening remarks. So Pat, please join us.
Thank you. Let's see if I can fit in here. Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Emily. I am so pleased to be here with all of you in this wonderful, wonderful space, another great Atlantic Live conversation, and I really look forward to hearing Jim Shelton speak because he has been so helpful to the cause of keeping kids on the path to a high school graduation diploma. And we worked with the Department of Education, and we are working with the Department of Education through the Ready to Learn grant, which is a program proven to prepare young children for learning success even before they begin school. And of course, we worked with Jim on American Graduate. Let's make it happen. And this is what I'd like to talk to all of you about briefly this morning. You may not know this, but public media's mission remains even more important than it was 40 years ago, especially in this world of hyper-connected communication, about which John Nesbitt, the author of Megatrends, said, "We're drowning in information, but we are starved for knowledge." Our commitment is to keep providing that knowledge through high-quality educational content delivered for free and commercial-free to every American, starting with our youngest children. And I have to tell you, we do have a secret agenda, not to sell them anything. We want them to become lifelong learners. And this was the impetus 4 years ago behind the creation of the American Graduate Initiative. Basically, public media looked at a statistic and decided we wanted to strengthen the education continuum from preschool to high school and beyond to lifelong learning. So we decided to begin this journey by trying to understand what was behind those terrible statistics of 1 million American boys and girls failing to graduate from high school every single year, year after year. It was such a daunting statistic. You almost wanted to throw up your hands and say, these kids can't make it anyway. They're truants, they're drug users, they're not smart, they can't learn. And perhaps that narrative enabled us all to look the other way. But we and all of you here today didn't look away. So our goal, public media's goal, was to tell another story, to start putting faces behind those statistics, to challenge the idea that being poor means you can't learn, to understand that many of these young people are living lives of such challenge, anyone would be hard-pressed to stay focused on staying in school. So working with our incredible team, and I know I'm going to leave out people because so many of you here are responsible for this success, Deb Sanchez and Stephanie Aronson and Michael Fergale at CPB, we started working with public media stations throughout the country, beginning with 9 Network, and many of those stations were in communities with what they called dropout factories. Then it was an interesting momentum because stations began partnering with community and business leaders, organizations such as My Brother's Keeper Alliance, America's Promise Alliance, Teach for America, the Boys and Girls Clubs of America, Excellence in Education, Communities and Schools, the United Way, Civic Enterprises, and hundreds more. Stations created local content that was paired with national content, documentaries and films, programs and newscasts, digital learning tools, town hall meetings with more than 2,000 teachers participating nationwide. And Jeffrey Lee from WHUT is here. And I remember that impactful, amazing, powerful town hall meeting where we just sat and listened and learned. And over time, through these stories, Americans were introduced to these kids and a different narrative. Filmmakers interviewed those who dropped out and those who were on the brink of dropping out, and we found that the stories are all different in their specifics, but similar when you learn that these kids are looking for a lifeline of support, what I would call caring, consistent support, a champion who will run alongside of them, along that track with them. And we found out they're smart, they're entrepreneurial, they have to be in order to survive, and you're going to be able to see and hear from many of them and the champions in their lives. If you tune in, here comes the commercial part. Tune in next Saturday, October 3rd, for the 4th annual, we're very proud of this, 4th annual American Graduate Day, when WNET 13 will broadcast live for 7 hours from the Tisch WNET studios at Lincoln Center in New York, with live remotes from stations throughout the country and, of course, employing web and mobile platforms. Former President George W. Bush will join Shaquille O'Neal. Now there's a partnership. To talk about the importance of being a champion in the life of just one child and what an amazing difference it can make, not only for the child, but the champion as well. And we have 3 champions with us this morning. I'd like to acknowledge them. Dr. Lucretia Taylor McDonald, where are you? Associate Director, A Place Called Home. Jerry Robinson, Vice President, Early Childhood Initiatives, Boston Children's Museum, and Jenny Lee, a special education teacher at State College High School. Please stand up. You do so much. Thank you. Through films such as Wes Moore's All the Difference, Nova's School of the Future, the PBS documentary Class of 2027, the Peabody Award honoree series 180 Days in a DC School, and The Home Stretch. I just wish I had time to talk to you about that film. It's a riveting story of teenagers who are homeless, sometimes living couch to couch, and what happens to them. In fact, this film is so impactful that it spurred research conducted by civic enterprises to really understand the experiences of homeless youth and to create a workable action plan. We know that this increased awareness, local engagement, and the work that all of you do have helped to move that graduation needle to over 80% nationwide. But we can't really claim victory just yet because according to the annual Building a Grad Nation report, while the national average has risen to over 81%, only 73% of low-income children are graduating from high school with their peers. And this report, supported by General Colin and Alma Powell's America's Promise Alliance, Civic Enterprises, the Alliance for Excellence in Education, and the Everyone Graduates Center from Johns Hopkins University is really focused on identifying where the need is most acute, learning and sharing what is effective and what really just doesn't work. So in order to reach 90% or greater graduation rates by 2020, we have to begin before triage is required. We have the ready-to-learn data that tells us when a child living in a high-poverty community is able to access the resources available to children in middle-class communities, they learn at the same or even higher rates than that of their more affluent peers. These kids are our kids. They're not somebody else's kids. They're worth the time and effort. We can make a difference. We know that the democratization of technology can give every child a world of information at one click. But we need the champions, the teachers, the educator influencers, the parents, the community and business leaders to stay with them, guiding their knowledge journey. Thank you for all you're doing to make this happen.
Thank you so much, Pat. And now I'm pleased to present my colleague, Steve Clemons, the Atlantic's Washington editor-at-large, to lead the conversation. Welcome, Steve and Jim, to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Okay, so you're the three champions. I never want you to sit together again. Okay? You go. You know, we're going to move you all around so that you get kind of rub off on everybody else. All right. So there'll be a little bit right. You agree, Pat? That's a good idea, right? So anyway, very nice to meet you. Thank you for what you're doing, and hopefully after this we'll have some coffee and stuff. And so go out and mingle. And get away from each other. Jim, thank you so much for joining us. As you all know, Jim is the Chief Impact Officer at TU, but he's probably the most impactful rock star, and I say this for those of us that are policy wonks, in the Obama administration at the Deputy Secretary. We know secretaries, but how many Deputy Secretaries can you name? Any? It's just about it, right? Yeah. So he was Deputy Secretary of Education, of course. Came out of a wide variety of things. Worked with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Worked with McKinsey and Company. Was the executive director of My Brother's Keeper. But as Deputy Secretary of Education, came in a way with Arne Duncan and changed, I think, at least aspirationally, how many of us think about the Education Department. So I just want to start off, Jim, and just ask you the question of, we're here on a Monday morning. It's a sellout crowd. I'm shocked. Why is this so hard? Why does WNET have to have a graduation day? What can put this kind of thing out of business so that the notion of people investing in education, getting kids ready, is easier? What are we missing that we're not doing that requires us to show up Monday morning at 8, requires Pat to invest in Shaquille O'Neal and George W. Bush partnerships? It sounds cool, but it just seems to me, why is it so hard?
So I'm going to answer your question, but I want to point out that the most important thing that you said in that overly generous introduction is former. And so anything I say right now is just this guy named Jim Shelton who happens to live in D.C.
It's so cool that the constraints are off.
So I want to be really blunt. The reality is that we have identified this problem now in very explicit terms. We know which are the high schools in the country that produce the majority of the dropouts in the country. We know that there are not dropouts, that in fact the context of these schools actually drives them out, or at least doesn't hold on to them as they go. We know where they are, in which cities, in which states, and yet, having had it lifted up now for multiple years, there is a lack of will to intervene and support these schools and communities in a way that actually changes the outcomes. Even though we have very clear examples of when you do the right things inside the schools, create the right kind of learning environment, put in the right kind of leadership, support the teachers to do the work that they need to do to really build relationships with students, that you can change the outcomes. Like, literally, we've got examples of schools where they have doubled the graduation rates in those in those schools. And so, for me, the first question is, why don't the people who have the power and influence to actually lean in on this issue lean in? And I actually don't have a good answer. other than something else seems to be more important to them. Something else seems to be more important to them than changing the outcomes for our kids. And I don't know, in certain circumstances, like people want to blame the unions in a lot of places. There's a lot of states where there are no unions, where these same schools still are a problem. Same kind of outcomes. But the lack of focus, the lack of resources, and the lack of willingness to make really hard decisions is the primary driver of this problem staying a problem, at least at the level that it is.
You know, part of the picture, I mean, I painted sort of a bleak picture, but it's really, there are elements of promise in the sense that particularly in communities that Pat was just addressing, particularly the Hispanic community and the African American community, both college entry and to a certain degree college completion are rising in both of those arenas, maybe not to the degree where they should be, but do you see trends as moving in a positive direction, and were there explicit things that you can take credit for that you did that are responsible for that?
I won't take credit for anything, but what I will say is that you're right, that the trend lines are going in the right direction. They're just not going fast enough. We have the highest graduation rates we've had in this country, and I think, frankly, since it's been measured, high school graduation rates. We have higher college enrollment rates. We know that those are translating into high persistence rates. Those are being led by Black and Latino students and increases in low-income students. We know that all of those trends are the kind of trends that we'd like to see, but the reality is it's still not fast enough. And the reason I say it's not fast enough is because it's happening in spots where you can see dramatic progress and places still exist where you see absolutely no progress. And we know enough now to know how to create at least significant progress almost everywhere, and it should be happening a lot faster. Now, there were several things I think that this administration did that were really, really important. The first thing is the president paid attention. And so just remember, I mean, it seems like so long ago, 2008, at the end of 2008, almost everybody thought the world was coming to an end. People's retirement were disappearing. Companies that we thought would never disappear were falling off the exchange every single day. And in the middle of trying to figure out how to turn around that crisis situation, the president said, you know what, let's take a big chunk of this money and put it in education. About $100 billion worth to stabilize the system, because we know our long-term future is going to depend on that. The second part was, which was even less intuitive, was let's take a fraction of that, 10%, and put it on things that we think are important to reform. And one of those was dealing with our worst performing schools in the country, and in particular, dropout factory high schools and the schools that feed them. And so it brought a level of attention and focus to those schools, even though we've been shining a light on it. People could say, well, great that you have a light shining on it, but there are no resources. And frankly, there was very little accountability around it. And that attention, I think, has made a big difference as well. The second thing is that it had an infrastructure to it. It had support. And so people did learn from each other. And the notion of doing things that work became much more important as a part of the work that the administration was doing. It wasn't just the evidence-based work like the kind of programs that I set up when I got there, but in the context of almost everything we did, the question was, how are you identifying what is working, whether there's a strong evidence base behind it or not, and how are you justifying how you're going to spend these resources based on it demonstrating before this produced a better outcome. In some places, we don't have a ton of that data, but in some places like this, we do. And people, I think, made better decisions in many cases. This is where it comes back to the political piece, though. The School Improvement Grant Program, not terribly popular, but did the focusing thing I talked about. But in order to get it through, you had 3 possible scenarios, and then you had another category, which was basically other. About 75% of people chose other. Now, I'm born and raised in D.C., and the thing that bothers me most is that the high school, I just left my 30th high school reunion.
You're looking good.
Thanks, appreciate it.
Yeah.
Getting out will do that for you. But the reality is that the high schools that we would have called bad when I was in high school are the same high schools we're talking about today.
Interesting.
And so what that means is that we willingly have sent kids into schools, in many cases where we knew half of them would wind up spilled out on the streets instead of going on to college or going on to any kind of profession that would allow them to sustain themselves for life. Like, knowingly and willingly, we did that. If we're not disturbed by that, shame on all of us.
You know, one of the dilemmas, and maybe this is too deep for this, but when I was listening to Pat and talking about the alliances, the champions, Colin Powell's investment in a lot of this, the various things you're trying to do, and I think the fact that you were running as the Chief Operating Officer of the Department of Defense, or I want to say Defense, it's almost like that, Department of Education. It's an opaque building to many. Many people don't understand what it does, what it's responsible for. It's controversial. It's just a black box to many folks. And when I think about education, you can think about the high end, but then you can also think about places we've talked a lot about here. I've talked to Randy Weingarten about McDowell County, West Virginia, one of the poorest counties in the United States. It's a bleak employment situation. It's very tough to look at the outcomes there. And, right or wrong, AFT's approach on this has been to think about wraparound services, that the problem isn't just school teachers or unions, that's the whole broader element of everything wrapped around that question. And to a certain degree, do you think it's fair when we think about these things that we silo the education policy area in a way and make it responsible for carrying so much, when really the equation is much more holistic?
So I think that it is naive to silo this work. The reality is that all of these things are interconnected. However, we know that we can transform lives inside schools. Mm-hmm. We know that there are high poverty schools all across the country that are doing much better than other high poverty schools, with kids that look very much the same. They have very similar needs. They have very much the same kind of issues going on in their communities. We know that teachers need the kind of supports that allow them to be effective in the classroom. We know that they need great leaders. We know they know great curriculum. We know that.
So can I stop you there for a moment? Don't mean to interrupt, but can you distill those best practices and say, boom, here's a high poverty school, here's a high poverty school, here's why this one's doing better, here's why this one's doing worse, and go out and sell that?
I think we are clear enough on many of the common elements, but one of the hardest things to do in education is the thing that is, frankly, I failed to do when I was there, is to figure out how to get effective practice to transfer. Like first, as many of the champions here on the front row can tell, get it to transfer down the hallway. And then building to building, and then district to district, and then state to state. So we do have really great examples of these things, but getting them to scale has been very, very difficult, and has plagued, frankly, the education sector for a long time. The second thing is, though, that we wind up in these fights that I think are completely ridiculous. And this one issue that we're talking about now is one of the prime examples. Is it poverty or is it the school?
Right.
Yes. Yes. Yes, poverty impacts kids' readiness to learn when they show up to school. But if they show up to school and the school is not ready to receive them however they show up, especially in schools where you know your kids are going to be traumatized, if you're not structured to deal with those issues and to provide really effective instruction, then you're not going to help them succeed. And so yes, we have to address the whole holistic issue, but it starts at the core of what is going to happen for that child when they get in that school. And is that school structured to perform as well as it can given its context? And then what other kinds of supports and services do you need to put in and around it to help them have the best chance of success with every single child in there? It is and both. It is not either or. And when we actually stop arguing about which one it is and start talking about how we integrate the solutions that we are already spending in many cases the money on, then we can actually produce solutions that are outsized. And we still haven't figured out how to do that well.
So demystify the Department of Education for me. I mean, is it doing anything that matters, that's moving the needle? If so, where? And on this issue of high school outcomes and college readiness, what are the 2 or 3 things that the Education Department is not doing that it should? That if you had had more time there and you were the secretary or the president, or just make yourself ruler of the universe, I mean, what would you move if you were able to move in DOE to sort of add to correct deficits?
All right, so let me first start with what's already happening that's really important. Right. So the Department of Education, there's an excellence part to its mission, there's a huge equity part to its mission. And I wind up in these odd conversations where people are going to talk about states versus the federal role, as if when there was not much of a strong federal role, equity got taken care of in the states. As if we didn't win. I mean, think what you will about No Child Left Behind, but the one thing it made barely clear is that we were not treating well, not educating effectively, huge swaths of the population, and they just happened to be of color, they just happened to be poor, and they were getting the short end of the stick. And that was all opaque before. Mm-hmm. And so now it is actually really transparent who's getting screwed by this process. Mm-hmm. And the Department of Education is there to say, this isn't right. Now, it started off with just the money.
Right.
And the money flowed in, and those gaps were still there even though Title I was there. Mm. Those gaps were still there even though IDEA and the special education dollars were flowing. So the transparency that comes with saying, hey, we need to make sure all of our children are being served effectively, that's a really important role. Mm-hmm. And we can decide what the accountability structure ought to look like, but the transparency, there's no question that needs to be there. Just to hold us all, mm-hmm. keep us all honest. The second thing is that the resources are important. The resources that go into early screening through IDEA. We know that we don't do enough to identify early the developmental delays that our kids have, and that if we do catch them early, we can do a lot better. The funding that comes through the federal government creates incentives for others to do it at the state level. That's really important. The support services that students with special needs receive because of that funding, really, really important. The ability of districts to use Title I effectively when they choose to do so to support kids that are high need, really, really important. All of those things are really important for addressing the equity issues, especially when you point them towards a clear set of outcomes that ensure every kid is being served well. What should be happening in ways that are even more important, more widespread than they are today. The reality is that we are structured to have the biggest and best, excuse the word, experimental platform for education that exists. We've got 50 states and 15,000 school districts trying to solve the problem of how to educate children well every single day. Yet we spend 0.5%, not even, on R&D in the education space. So when you are spending all of these resources on education, $600+ billion a year, and you say, so how much do we spend on figuring out what's working well with whom, in what context?
You just lauded Laureen Powell-Jobs for $50 million in rethinking high school curriculum. Is that enough? Is she doing enough to...
Let's put it in perspective. Department of Defense, I think it's $70 to $80 billion a year in R&D. That's not including DARPA.
Right.
Health, $80+ billion a year. That's not including the amount of funding that goes into R&D from the private sectors. Like the amount of money we spend on those compared to what we spend in less than $1 billion, $700 million in education. Not even comparable.
Considering not to blow this out, Malala yesterday, apparently, Malala, who won the Nobel Peace Prize, said yesterday, if the world spent, so it's a big number, probably double the U.S. defense spending, spent for 8 days of its spending on defense, that 8 days would fund global education for women all around the world. It's sort of an interesting. I don't know if she's right, but it's a good headline.
Let's put it this way: it's way too close to right, even if it's not exactly right.
Right. So you're now in the technology area. I'm very interested because I'm a technology embracer. I sort of look at things you were just alluding to, like data. That we have so many platforms out there that the data, our experiences, should fit into something that gives us greater insights in how to do all this better. It's interesting, the College Board told me that they can identify today 300,000 people who show incredible promise before college, so this is after high school, that are not on resource tracks, where they're not easily reachable, they're not in communities that are typically ones that would have the track. So this is a known thing out there. And so part of the challenge is how to get those 300,000 bright lights into a college track with resources and support. So the data is there, and I'm wondering to what degree you think, now you're in a tech company, you're making money as a tech guy, you're out of the government nonprofit world. So tell us why you've made this jump
Sure.
to 2U, and whether or not there have been a lot of critics of the technology space that it really isn't going to be a solvent. But take us down that track.
Yeah. So, first question about why I left why I left. And to be honest, it was family. I was in the administration for 6 years. That was 2 years past my promise date to my wife. I had the honor of serving as the executive director of my brother's keeper, but I somehow brilliantly negotiated to keep my job as deputy secretary while I did that. My wife thinks that was one of the smartest things I ever did. And I pretty well almost killed myself. So that explains why I was going, and I needed to leave in time to give somebody really good a chance to have time to get something done. Why I went to 2U. So I am not a believer that technology solves all problems. What I do believe is that technology can enable lots of things to happen. Technology in particular is great for access issues. Right? You can get lots of resources to lots of people really quickly. The good news about that is you can get lots of resources to people. The bad news is you can get lots of bad resources to people too. The second thing is that it does provide you with an opportunity for a level of insight that should make all of our work a lot easier. The reality is that we ask teachers every single day to do something that's incredibly difficult. Like anyone who's ever taught, especially at the elementary level, has been told, differentiate your instruction. Now, if you translate that, that means look at a room about this big and know exactly what you know and don't know and what you're interested in, and you, and you, and you, and you, and then craft lessons that are going to address every single one of you and where you are and what you're interested in, and it's going to keep you engaged in order to achieve a very specific outcome that is pretty rigorous. And oh, by the way, I got to do a whole lot of this in the course of a year. And what do I get? I get colored markers and a whiteboard, and not a lot of additional insight and support. Does that sound familiar? So the reality is that the technology and the tools should allow us to actually give teachers the tools to do a lot of what we've been asking them to do for a long time without the benefit of those kind of tools.
Right.
It also gives us the opportunity to think about very different kinds of instruction. And so things that seem really common sense or not so important, they turn out to be really important. So when you have, I'll just say, a video lecture, there was a textbook company I won't name that, as a kind of a giveaway to one of their textbooks, had created all this great math content with a math teacher of the year. And it had sat unused for a really long time on their website, very low hit rates. They got a company to develop an online textbook, and the online company used some of their content from the same teacher. And what they found is when the students encountered the video in the context of the textbook, they watched it, and they watched it again, and they watched it again, and they watched it again. Now, again, I don't know how many of you have taught. How many times do you think a student who doesn't get it when you explain it is going to raise their hand to say, I still don't get it? How many times would you? But
I would.
being able to...
Yeah, I'm difficult. I'm difficult.
You're that guy.
No.
That's why you're the question asking side of this thing. But just even the simple ability to, without embarrassment, without shame, to keep going back and looking and looking and looking, lets you know. But beyond that, if you have an assessment tied to that, then what should happen pretty quickly over time is, well, I can look and see whether an individual student got it or not. But if I look at across the concept and nobody got it, that's not on them. That's on me or the textbook or whatever it happens to be. But we have not had the ability to have that insight, and we now have the ability to have that insight. So I do think technology has the opportunity to provide a transformational set of tools and resources to us, but education is still ultimately about connecting human beings that have knowledge, skills, competencies, attitudes, behaviors with people who need to learn a new set, and using the best tools available to keep them engaged and motivated enough till they get to the finish line. That human element is never going to go anywhere. The question is, what kind of tools and resources can we provide to amplify the capabilities that our best teachers have, and to support our teachers that are not that strong to get a lot better than they are today. Teaching is a large, large workforce. I think think it's still the second largest workforce in the country behind retail. That means like you need to, every single teacher is not going to be a martyr and a rock star.
Right.
There are folks who are really good people who want to do really good work who just need a lot more support than they get today. And that's frankly every workplace that exists. But we don't do that, and especially in our communities that lack resources. They get really new people. People don't stay a long time.
So let me ask you a question. How many? I was struck this way. Anybody from the Eastern Shore of Maryland here? Some people, you know. So there's this place out there. I think it's called Cliff City. I have a house in Chestnut. So if you drive out to Cliff City, there's this little red house, and it's a house that I think was built around the 1830s. It's a red schoolhouse, and there's a story out there. There's a plaque about the. Doesn't mention the name. I sort of feel like there ought to be sort of a statue to whichever teacher, likely a woman who was the school teacher here, often with about 50 students in this schoolhouse, who would teach across all grades. But it was the schoolhouse for that area of the Eastern Shore of Maryland for ages. And I was sort of thinking about, you know, what likely she had to deal with. And today the tools are different, but the tools and the change in technology, what's available by data, what's available in terms of assessment, is very, very rapid. But I'm wondering to what degree we have a kind of the pain of generational change in our systems, that it's hard to bring all that and sew that together because we have basically incumbents on boards of schools and the teaching that just isn't there yet. To what degree was that a problem for you?
Oh, it's a huge problem. You know, there was an article actually. I think I may have retweeted it. It was there was a parent who struggled to help their child with homework, and they blamed it on the Common Core math, and so they wrote this check for zero money because they said if you followed the Common Core math. It turned out they were like absolutely wrong. That's the first thing. But the second thing was that what it did do though was make clear that the way they thought about it was, this is not the way I learned this, and the way I learned it was good enough for me. Why isn't it good enough for them? And what struck me is I still remember this conversation my parents had with me about the new math, right? And I was like, thank God, even though they didn't really understand it, they encouraged me to just go ahead and learn it anyway. And I thought, and if we're doing our jobs based on what we just talked about, like I'll be getting my son to be open-minded about the new ways that they're going to teach his kids. And so the reality is, if we're doing our jobs, then every generation is going to know more and more about how you teach everything that we need to learn better than we did before. And it's not going to look the way we think it looks. Heck, nothing looks like it looked 10 years ago. And so if we think that education ought to look the same, we're just sadly mistaken. And I'll give you my classic example. People worry about the relationship part of schools and going online. Ask folks in the next generation how many of their really good friends they really have never met. They met them online through another friend of a friend online, and they've established a years-long relationship, exchanged incredible information with each other, in constant contact, and have a deep relationship, and they haven't met them in person. I mean, that's real. And we're starting to get there. In the work that I do right now with universities, we're helping to take their graduate programs online. It helps to take it to scale, but when they have there's an asynchronous part that they do on their own, but when they have their class every week, they're in there with an interface that looks like, everybody here is old enough to know what the Brady Bunch looked like, but this, right? But think of it about 12 people plus your professor for an hour, and in some cases up to 3 hours, which I would not recommend again. But, and when was the last time any of you in your college experience or graduate school experience sat face-to-face with your professor and 12 of your students for an hour every week, where everyone had done the work before they got in the room because you can't actually see everybody else's answers until you put yours in, and was ready to rock and roll? And oh, by the way, I'm doing this and I still have a regular job. And so when I do what I do in my professional setting, which is I wind up in this group, we all swap emails, phone numbers, LinkedIn, Facebook pages. We are in constant contact to help each other get through this experience. Those folks, when you ask them about their online graduate program, if you did a word cloud of the word they use most often, it's intimate. when would you have called any of your graduate classes intimate? Forget about undergrad. And then the second thing I'll say is, like, that connection means that in many of these programs, they are showing up for graduation at higher rates than the kids that are on campus. I shouldn't even call them kids, than the other folks that are on campus. So that affiliation, not only are they creating a peer network that they feel really close with, they're creating a connection to an institution. So this is like, they don't think they're in some online program. They think they go to UNC or Georgetown or whatever the case might be. And yet, the vast majority of their experience they've had online. And these are people not in their teens. These are people in their 30s and 40s who are trying to advance their careers while they manage their kids and their current life trajectory.
Do you think this focus on graduating, on readiness out of high school, getting this track, do you think it's forcing a divergence between education and credentialization?
I think that we keep trying to oversimplify.
Is that a stupid question?
No, it's not. It is a really, really important question, because I think it is a question of who's going to get access to what. And here's what I mean by that. We've always had debates about vocational versus general ed. And that, frankly, is beginning to translate up to post-secondary in a way that's much more explicit right now, where, frankly, for the first time in a long time, higher education's value proposition is being questioned in a pretty significant way. It's clear that college pays.
Yeah, folks like Peter Thiel saying don't go to college.
Yeah, don't go to college.
Killer.
Questions about whether liberal arts has value or not, and people having to prove it.
Right.
And frankly, even some of the accountability stuff that we're trying to do to make sure people can pay back their debts and things like that. We're focusing on the income of graduates and things like that, driving a focus on one aspect of post-secondary, which is, does it help you get a job? Does it help you get a well-paying job? Does it help you get a promotion if you're at the graduate level? But that's one aspect of it. There's the other aspect of it is, did you learn to be a better whatever it is that you went to become? And are you being prepared, because when that job disappears, which it is going to disappear on you sometime before you're ready to retire, are you prepared to learn how to do the next one? Mm-hmm. So this achievement, of course, me being an ex-consultant, I got a framework for it. Like, the first one is advancement. The second one is actual achievement and performance. The third one, though, is this thing we just finished talking about, the affiliation. Like, people go to school to build social capital. They don't talk about it that way. But they also want to build networks. They want to build friendships and relationships that they think are going to support them through their lives. They're going to meet new people. They want to have new experiences. And in the best cases, they want to be connected to an institution that can support them and is going to have the reputation that's going to propel them through the rest of their lives and careers. That affiliation part also needs to be nurtured. And then the last piece is aspirations. Like, people want more for themselves. They want to be better versions of themselves. They want to be a part of something bigger. They want to change the world, frankly, for a lot of them. And that is also a part of the definition of what needs to happen. And so here's where this comes back to.
It's not only their aspirations, but it's the expectations of it. I think when you think about My Brother's Keeper, you think about Colin Powell's partnerships, a lot of that has to do with changing, the calculus of expectation. I heard Jeb Bush last weekend talking about Hispanic students setting higher standards, having greater expectations, and that they're rising in Florida to meet them. It's interesting. I want to go to the audience in a minute, but I want to raise an
Can I say one last thing about that?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Because the point I wanted to make about what you said is, I think the question on the table now is, I think some kids are going to get the opportunity to be prepared to go to institutions and to get into institutions that provide those full range of things. And I think some kids are going to be trained to get jobs. And the question becomes, how do we enable, one, how do we let them be really clear about the trade-off that they're making?
Right.
How do we allow more kids access to the whole package? And how do we hold institutions accountable for being really transparent about what they are providing and what they're not? By the way, that first part about, like, are you going to be better off than if you didn't go to college at all? Can you pay back your debt? That's really important. But it's not the whole package. Sorry.
No. We're living, before I go to the audience, we're living in a really interesting era that feels to me like what it must have felt like to many in the progressive civil rights movement in the 60s, where we have neglected communities. Ta-Nehisi Coates, my colleague, has written beautifully and powerfully recently about violence towards certain communities, the neglect in communities, over-incarceration, school-to-prison pipelines, that you yourself tweeted the other day about this predictive crime thing that's beginning to emerge as racial profiling, as community profiling. And so you've got, I mean, it's a very uncomfortable discussion for many, but you've got built-in biases within a system that we have today. And I often feel like our discussions about educational outcomes just try never to address those issues. And when I read Ta-Nehisi, you see, damn, he's right. And what do we do to move the educational aspirational opportunities when you see so much built-in bias that is almost part of American culture?
So what I would say is you do something that looks a lot like My Brother's Keeper. So if you look at My Brother's Keeper, what it did is it provided a framework that says, yes, boys of color in this country, throughout their lives, doesn't matter at what point you look, are at the bottom end of any bad statistic that there is, and at the top of any worst statistic that there is when it comes to bad things like incarceration. And yet, in order to address those issues, it looks across their lifespan and says, if we did better at diagnosing, because those early developmental delays, if we did a better job at addressing the issues of reading by third grade, if we better manage that transition from middle school to high school and to high school graduation, that any young person who's on the bottom end of the performance spectrum who needs more support will benefit from all the same kinds of things that we would do. But in particular, kids who are subject to the kind of biases that we're talking about are going to benefit more. But it also doesn't stop there. It says, yeah, there are a couple of things that really take kids off track, and they're completely disproportionate. Our criminal justice system. And so what are communities doing to, one, keep kids from getting connected to the system? Because as soon as you are connected once, your odds of it is hard to get out, and it impacts all those other positive outcomes that we talked about.
Right.
It's not like, oh, you're just going to be connected to the system. Your odds of graduating even from high school go down by 50%. So we need to be really clear that these things, it is, as I said before, and both. That if we want to produce the educational outcomes that we want, we have to begin to address these other issues, and we have to do it especially for the populations that we know and watch every single day play out at the worst end of America's biases.
Right. Thank you. Let me open the floor to comments, questions, folks. Right here. We have a microphone for you.
I'm Christine.
You're on.
It's on.
Christine Moreno-McGee from George Washington University. You mentioned that technology is the touchstone for education in the future. With the landscape of the intersection of states' rights, education funding, and federal mandates of accountability, do you see a landscape where we would have equal access across 50 states to technology that is needed?
Yes. So the short answer to that is yes. The question is what people do with it when they get it, right? So one of the things that we didn't talk about is the president made a promise to try and connect 99% of schools over a 5-year period. One of the things that came out of that was the work the FCC did to double E-rate. That is on track. So, there's multiple things that have to happen, but connectivity to the vast majority of schools in the country and the vast majority of kids, in particular low-income kids, is on the way. Broadband, being connected, is kind of necessary, but not sufficient. The good news is the macro forces are working with us. So devices are getting cheaper and more powerful every single day. And so putting devices in the hands of kids is going to be a reality relatively quickly. Digital content, high-quality digital content, is becoming easier and easier to produce. The question is the high-quality part. Lots of free content, but is it curated? Is it actually organized in a way that makes it easy for teachers to access it and when and where they need it? Does it actually allow you to get enough insight from it to take advantage of all the kinds of opportunities I talked about before? That is one of the key questions, and it comes back to everyone's really focused on this question of free content. I'm actually focused on what's going to keep people investing in creating better content. Right? Like, what makes somebody want to invest in? I'm going to digress for a second. So I talked before about how much money goes into R&D for defense and medicine. Like, why is that?
Because they have an incentive.
and that incentive drives them to have people who have a whole job of going and getting more money for R&D in their sector. Like, it's just that simple. So I'm very focused on how do you get a sector, an industry going that makes the same kind of demands for building human beings, developing our children, developing our workforce, that these folks have for building better airplanes and bombs. And people see that in conflict. I see it as wholly the same.
That's a very tweetable moment right there. I just want to sort of note that.
So I do think that the question of how it is used is going to be the big differentiator. I'm worried that for some kids it's going to look like textbooks online as opposed to the real kinds of opportunities that technology can bring. And I worry in general about the capacity to absorb the kind of change that technology can bring to a system. In 15,000 school districts, some of whom have limited capacity of their own to deal with the day-to-day, let alone major, not only technical transformation, but cultural transformation. Like, how do you support teachers to fundamentally change the way they do their practice because of the availability of these tools? And if you can't figure that out, then having the technology is not going to be worth a darn.
Can I ask just one quick piggyback question on this? It seems to me that there's so much variation out there, which is you're getting that what technology should be able to do, although it's super controversial, and how many of you are teachers? You're all going to really hate me here in a minute. I love all of you, so let's just say I'm thinking way ahead. And is that the variability in outcomes or variability in school districts. I was just with the mayor of Tampa and San Antonio down in a conference, the U.S. Hispanic Chamber of Commerce the other day. And when you mentioned school boards, they both shied away. They said, oh, we don't have anything. So when you've got that variability, technology should give you the ability to leapfrog all that variability, right? If you're going to design it right. And if you're going to have I mean, maybe I'm wrong, maybe,
So here's what I'll say.
But I mean, the outcome problem or the racial bias problem or the inability to reach into McDowell County, you should be able to do something different with technology.
Absolutely.
To leapfrog that, right?
So let me say what's definitely true about that. What's definitely true is that everyone should have access much more easily to lots more than they have. Like, there's not really any excuse for every high school in the country should have access to every AP course there is.
Right.
Foreign language, there should be no limitation on that. Foreign languages that kids want to take. It's available online. The outcomes more and more are producing at the same levels as they are in the classrooms. So those kind of access questions are there. What's interesting is that, especially for new teachers, like, you all remember being a first-year teacher? Remember how heavily you relied on whatever it was that anybody gave you? I don't tweet this one, but I used to say, like, overprescribed in the first year is an oxymoron. Like, people want whatever you can give them in those early years while they're trying to figure out, how do you actually manage this class and teach? And I know I need to develop a new lesson plan every day. I'd love to do something creative, but boy, if you gave me something that worked, or I thought worked, I'd be really happy to take it right now. There's a segment that don't need that. There's a large segment that do. Right. And it ought to really help with that kind of stuff.
Interesting.
And then with the kind of tools and resources that we talked about, there are gifted teachers every day who are able to do the kind of magic that I talked about every single day without the kind of tools that I talked about. They do it. They reach every kid. They keep them all engaged. They give them something that keeps them challenged if they're starting to drift off and they're ahead of the pack. They find a way to remediate the kids that are behind. There are a set of teachers who can do that. It doesn't matter what they give them. You can put them under a tree somewhere with 50 kids, and they're still going to figure out how to get it done.
Yes, right up here in front.
Yeah.
We're going to do a lightning round here real fast.
Yeah.
Fast answers,
Sorry,
fast questions. No, I do too.
Hi, my name is Jeff Lee. I'm General Manager of WHUT here in Washington. And as being associated with Howard University, is environment part of what you're doing? Because I see a situation where, as with HBCUs in general, but at Howard University in particular, you've got an incoming freshman class with average SAT scores higher than anybody in the nation, black or white. However, 60% of the students at Howard University are Pell Grant eligible. So this issue of economic depravity or having low economics but high potential is borne out every day at HBCUs and particularly at Howard University. And particularly in elementary school where if that same model existed, I mean, I know, for example, personal experience, some of my best teachers were African-American male teachers. So I went into those classrooms seeing something that looked like me, but also seeing something that valued me. And I knew that, so it opened me up. And that was the critical thing to getting education, is opening up oneself to that. So I'm glad to hear you say it's not an either or, because lack of graduation is a symptom. It's not an issue.
Right.
It's more of a symptom than that. So how does environment and boosting and acknowledging environment come into play?
And you graduated from Morehouse, which is
Yes, I
another
did.
HBC.
So hopefully, if you've taken anything from what I said today, it is the and both comment, right? And so it is about figuring out how we do recognize the environment, especially that low-income kids are in, what that means they've been exposed to, both for good and for bad, what it means about their, pet peeve. Everyone keeps talking about how we need to teach these kids persistence and resilience and grit. Come to Southeast with me. I will show you persistence, resilience, and grit. The key is, can we get them to apply their persistence and resilience and grit after they go through everything that they've gone through to the things that we need them to learn? Like, that's the only question. So, yes, environment matters. Yes, we need to figure these things out. Yes, it needs to happen inside the school building as well as outside. I see Michael here from Turnaround for Children. Like, we know that kids are under post-traumatic stress when they enter school buildings. They have seen many, many horrible things in their lives, and it impacts them every single day. And yet we have not built an infrastructure, one, to equip the schools, let alone the teachers, to know how to deal with kids that are suffering from PTSD. Right? So, yes, we need to build that infrastructure, but that is on top of needing to build high-quality instructional environments.
Plug for Ta-Nehisi Coates, who was one of your graduates. Between the World and Me, his book is all about that. But yes, right here.
Hi, my name is Amanda Granger. I'm a producer at WNET, and I was just curious, in the past couple of years with the anniversary of Brown versus Board, there's been a lot of interesting coverage about school integration. Do you think that there's a future for school integration, and if so, what would the role of the federal government be?
So let me take just a couple more real quickly,
Sure,
because
go.
we're going to have to close right on time. Yes, right here.
My name is Lysester Johnson. I'm the CEO of Academy of Hope Adult Public Charter School. And my question really does have to do with what happens after the kid drops out. My biggest criticism of the K-12 system is that we assume that everyone will proceed with their educational program in a straight line, and despite our best efforts. So what I'm really interested in your opinion about creating a stronger second chance system that when students exit, you know, having a quality education, adult education system when they're ready to re-enter school.
And there was one right up here, right? Mr. Okay, one right here, and we're going to have to end there.
Naomi Shelton with UNCF. So I have a quick question about community engagement. No relation.
Yeah.
We've had this discussion multiple times. But he always remembers me, so that's helpful.
You know, I have a staff member on my team named Hillary Clemons, and I've just decided to adopt her as a
Right.
member. We can't find out where, but it has to be. Yeah.
Has to be. So my question is related to community engagement. We talk about high tech, but low tech. What is it that communities can do? I don't have children, but what can someone like me, my peers, what can we do to help support education just holistically?
Okay, great. So 3 questions: school integration,
Got 'em.
second chance
Yep.
after education, and high tech, low tech. How to make this work?
Okay.
3
so
minutes.
I'm actually going to hit them in that order. So on the integration question, more and more we're finding economic integration is at least as important as racial integration. There's lots of important things that come with racial integration, but the data is really, really strong on economic integration. What that requires is, you keep referencing Ta-Nehisi, housing policy. Housing policy is the biggest barrier to economic integration. That and our own personal choices. And so we've got to find a way to make it worth people's while to think again about the benefits of economic integration. We've got to make it easier for folks to get into communities where they are, in some cases, economic minorities, but have all the supports and services that they need. So moving to opportunity programs, great success for kids under 13. But in some ways, it's despite the fact that they move and they get none of the services they would have gotten when they had been in a cluster in a highly concentrated community. So I think that there is a future, but it's going to require some really concerted effort. And it's going to probably require legal remedies as well as policy, as well as really progressive folks, and I'll come back to this on the ground, foot soldiers marching to get it done. I'm a huge proponent, especially in large systems, of multiple pathways to graduation. All the stuff that we've talked about in environment means that, and the differences among kids means that we have to accommodate the fact that kids are going to fall in and out of the system, go slower, faster through the system than we would like for a whole variety of reasons. And if we don't create and recognize that that is a reality of the vast majority of the large portions of the kids that we need to serve well, then shame on us. So we do know something about creating more effective programs for kids who need an alternative pathway, what those look like, how you accelerate kids. We used to think that if they got to middle school or high school and they were off track, oh, well, put them on something else because they can't get there. We know that's absolutely not true anymore. We even have kids who start off track and are now graduating early college, high school as the alternative pathway. So I think that everyone needs to learn a lot more about the multiple pathways and alternative schools and transfer schools and some of the other models that have emerged. There's a great evidence base that's emerging around many of these models as well. So we just need to do more. And we need to be more thoughtful about how we allow funding streams to blend so that when we can realize the full savings of having somebody who may be a little bit older stay in and get educated as opposed to being a burden in some other way. On community. And I'm going to specifically stay on our folks who don't have kids in school. Everyone talks about the parents and the parents' role. I'm a firm believer, though it doesn't always manifest the way you want it to, that parents do the best they can for their kids. The reality is that what we've had, especially in this last, I'd say since the recession, is an incredible, I want to call it selfishness. There's a trend of selfishness that says we don't want to invest in our schools anymore. We don't want to invest in higher ed. People talk about the increases in college tuition. College tuition in most state institutions increased dramatically. Why? State funding for the institution has been cut dramatically. Like, and that part of the story is like, people do not understand that, and the community ought to be livid. Same thing at the K-12 level. You got teachers who haven't gotten raises in years. And people are like, oh my gosh, this state has a dramatic drop in the number of people who are signing up to become teachers. Shocking. It was already such a high-paying profession. And so there's a selfishness that we need to counteract. And I think it is not because the country is more selfish. I think it's because the people who actually care about these issues, who are recognize that if we want the best, we have to invest in our kids, we're too quiet. When we let these other loud voices run us, and that's a shame. And I'll end on this point. This is not going to be pretty. This is going to be a fight. I started by saying that the problem exists because we let it. And I still believe that's true. And I think that people sometimes need to get shaken to wake up. And people who have interests need to get knocked down. And so, community, at the broadest sense, needs to get fired up. And I'm not talking about like a presidential chant. I'm talking about in the same way people take to the streets when it's really obvious, like a video of somebody getting shot, need to take to the streets because, as we heard at the beginning, 1 million kids a year are having their lives snatched away from them, and we're not doing a darn thing.
Ladies and gentlemen, Jim Shelton.
Wow.
Let me just say in closing, Jim, thank you. I mean, you are someone that's not only sort of the soul and conscience of a lot of these questions, but someone who has really, more than anyone else I know, really wired to kind of see a way out, a track out. I want to commend WNET, and I want to commend your, it's on Saturday, the program that you'll be doing. Of all topics that I wade through, this is the one I wish I did less of because the problem was solving itself. But I happen to know that that won't likely be the case, and it really requires a stakeholder approach. It requires a lot of new thinking, and thank you for leading the way on so much of that. I want to commend WNET and thank all of you for joining us. You're welcome to mix and mill about. Meet the champions. Here, stand up again. You know, just get away from each other. That's all I ask. And thank you all very much for coming.